Can you imagine going to your primary doctor to complain about a painful cough and they recommend heroin? Or you tell them that you just have no energy, so they suggest meth? I can't either. But before these and other drugs were drugs, they were medications. Today, we are going to look at how pretty much every street drug began as a legal medication and how they poison thousands upon thousands each year. Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we explore all things that are at least a little bit dark, from deadly diseases to natural disasters, from true crime to man-made catastrophes. So if this is your kind of thing, come along and let's get morbid. Opium has a long history and has been around for thousands of years. I'm talking like ancient Greece old. It was originally used for pain reduction and as an anesthetic for surgeries such as amputation. About 1,000 years ago, it was used to treat diarrhea and eye diseases. In the 1800s, it became very popular in the United States and was available everywhere in tonics and elixirs. It was particularly popular among the middle and upper class ladies. In 1803, a fabulous new opium-based medication called morphine was developed, and it was a powerful painkiller. Fun fact, by 1830, 1 in 3 deaths due to poison were actually opium and morphine overdoses. So ODing is by no means a new thing. Morphine was heavily used during the American Civil War, and by that point, the hypodermic needle had been invented, so soldiers who had sustained battle injuries were able to get instant relief through injectable morphine. That was incredible. Until it wasn't. Luckily for the drug manufacturers, battle injuries meant continual pain, which meant continual use of morphine, and also opium. So for those manufacturers, it meant continual income, money. So many veterans of the Civil War became addicted to morphine, and that is in fact the US's first opioid epidemic. Then came heroin. A crude form of heroin was first created by a researcher who worked at a hospital in London in 1874. But it was another 20 years before a scientist working for the German pharmaceutical company Bayer, yeah, that Bayer, further refined the formula and created, dun dun dun, heroin. I kid you not, it was marketed as a cough suppressant, but specifically for tuberculosis patients. As a derivative of morphine, it was cheaper to make than morphine, yet it was stronger than morphine. And in comparison to morphine, it was said to be less addictive and safer. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. It was actually more addictive than morphine, and it certainly wasn't safe. Yet, onto the market it went, and it was sold under the brand name heroin from 1898 to 1910. Less than 10 years after heroin was first created, a fun new drug guaranteed to put the pep in your step burst out onto the scene: cocaine. Although first created in the 1850s, not to mention that the coca plant has been used medicinally, ritually, and socially for thousands of years in the Andes Mountains, it wasn't until the 1880s that cocaine finally gained attention. In 1883, Bavarian soldiers were given cocaine to help with fatigue. Then, in 1884, a not insignificant figure named Sigmund Freud, personally not a fan, became a big proponent of the miracle drug cocaine. Side note, I wonder how many of his theories were influenced by his cocaine addiction. Moving on. 2 years after that, a man from Atlanta, Georgia, began selling a drink called Coca-Cola, which was made from coca leaves and cola nuts. Each were known for their stimulant properties. Although Coca-Cola wasn't advertised as a medicine, it was invented by a doctor/pharmacist named John Pemberton. Disclaimer, Coca-Cola no longer is made with coca leaves or cola nuts, in spite of the name. Anyway, soon, drinks and tonics containing cocaine were everywhere. Oh, and it was also estimated that by 1902, there were around 200,000 American cocaine addicts. It's easy to see how that happened. Of course, they couldn't have that, though. So in 1914, cocaine was made illegal. It wasn't until the 1970s that cocaine rebounded in popularity, especially among those going to disco clubs. But at this point, the country seemingly forgot about the early part of the century when hundreds of thousands of Americans were addicted to cocaine, since people were convinced that, in fact, cocaine wasn't addictive or dangerous. Insert eye roll here. Oh, did I say that out loud? Oops. Anyway, cocaine was also associated with the wealthy and especially with traders on Wall Street in the 80s. But suddenly, everything changed in 1985 when a new form of cocaine appeared: crack cocaine. It was more affordable for those who couldn't afford powder cocaine. But it also seemed to be more deadly and came with an increase in the cities. It was most popular among inner city blacks. Following public outcry, laws surrounding the new drug were written and carried much higher penalties. A crack dealer on the corner would get more time than a powder cocaine dealer pushing kilos. How is that fair? Anyway, let's jump all the way back to 1906. Now, in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was enacted, which prohibited the sale of misbranded or adulterated foods and drugs. Before that, it wasn't uncommon for people to buy over-the-counter medications, not knowing that narcotics were inside of them. They had morphine, heroin, cocaine. Unscrupulous pharmacists added addictive substances, knowing that they were addictive, to ensure that their customer kept coming back for more. The new act meant that people finally knew what they were consuming. In 1914, the government decided it was time to control and limit narcotics use. And more specifically, the law's goal was to regulate the sales and the use of narcotics. It required the manufacturers, sellers, and distributors of narcotics to register and pay taxes on them. It also required them to keep records of all transactions regarding narcotics. Sadly, by the end of the 1910s, narcotics addiction went from being seen as a medical condition to being seen as deviant and criminal, and was often associated with immigrants during a time of extreme xenophobia. Hating immigrants and addicts, it's like times haven't changed. Anyway, other drugs also were affected by the new law. Those were cocaine and marijuana. Want to hear something wild? Before 1919, it was normal to prescribe narcotics to keep addicts satisfied and to keep them comfortable. After 1919, it was considered unethical to supply an addict, so instead of getting regulated morphine or heroin or cocaine through the doctor, they started getting it on the streets. But can you imagine? You go to your doctor who is also your heroin dealer? What I find very interesting is that some of the cities and towns set up places where addicts could legally get narcotics. The two things driving these clinics, so to speak, were profit on one hand and keeping the people off the streets and out of trouble. So, not the noblest of reasons. Not harm reduction. But of course, the federal government wasn't happy about the clinics, and every single one of them had closed down by the end of February 1923. It was around this time that our next great drug came onto the scene: methamphetamine. No, it's not a joke. You did hear that right. It was first created in 1887, but didn't become popular among physicians until the 1920s. It was originally used for raising blood pressure, enlarging nasal passages, and giving tired people some energy. Within a decade, people began taking it upon themselves to take this medication, which at the time was available over the counter through an inhaler, which was called Benzedrine. Then, during the Second World War, just like the Bavarian soldiers had been given cocaine, soldiers were given amphetamines to keep them alert and improve their mood because, they weren't in the middle of the deadliest war in history. Then, after the war, the soldiers continued to receive amphetamines, but this time it was to help depression caused by their time in combat. Soon enough, it seemed like everyone was taking them, from truckers taking it to stay awake, to students needing to study, to housewives who took it to help with their energy and focus and to help with their depression. Yeah, those happy 1950s housewives that all the trad wives are nostalgic about. Sorry to break it to you, but those women were all high on drugs. They were literally numbing their depression and taking methamphetamine to give them the energy to maintain those absurdly high standards. Then, in the early 60s, it was revealed that people were buying the injectable form and injecting themselves with amphetamines, which they called mainlining. As the government began cracking down on this new form of drug use, speed labs began popping up where people were making the drug themselves in order to satisfy the people's demand. In the 1970s, amphetamines were scheduled by the FDA and its use began to fall off. However, in the 90s, a new form of the drug spread across the country like a plague. It originally appeared among biker gangs in the 70s, but eventually moved on to underemployed blue-collar 20 and 30-somethings. This form was able to be made just about anywhere, and it was able to be smoked as opposed to inhaled or injected. Can you guess what it is? It starts with meth and ends with amphetamine. Yep, crystal meth. The DEA's domestic enemy. Oh, the DEA. Yeah, how could I forget? The DEA, or Drug Enforcement Administration, didn't come around until the 1970s. Before that, there was the BNDD, or Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. That was formed in the 1930s as the government trying to put some organization and power behind the fight against drugs. But it wasn't just the US that was worried about narcotics. Between 1931 and 1933, 25 countries got together and agreed that each country would limit the production to just what was needed to meet medical demand. This was supposed to limit how many narcotics would end up on the black market, but it doesn't really seem like it worked. As we have reached the 30s, I want to go back and talk a little bit about what is known on the street as benzos. Benzodiazepines are a type of sedative called a barbiturate. The first of which was created in 1903 and was called Barbitol. At the time, it was prescribed as a sleep aid and was more popular than the previous sleep aids because it had only a few side effects, and the taste wasn't bitter like others. Soon, it became popular for treating psychiatric patients to make them more amenable to therapy. In addition to those uses, it was first used effectively for epilepsy. And finally, it was used as an anesthetic for minor operations. So you can imagine there were a lot of barbiturates around. And over time, over 2,500 different barbiturates were created. And 50 of those were actually put into medical use. Barbiturates began to grow in popularity, but nothing like it would during the 1930s. Do you remember what history class taught you about the 1930s? If you don't, that's okay. It was the Great Depression. 1 in 4 workers were unemployed, and even for those who still had their jobs, their income dropped by a whopping 42%. To put that in perspective, the unemployment rate today is 4 out of 100. And the income? God, that would be like normally taking home $1,000 and then suddenly you're only bringing home $420 per week. But the kicker is your bills are still there. Food, clothes, rent. How do you afford it all? Not only was it the Great Economic Depression, but it was a Great Depression of the people. As you can imagine, people were under unbelievable stress, and often they turned to barbiturates to help them cope. At the time, people were under the belief that barbiturates were safe because every drug ever sold by a company has been safe. I don't hate Big Pharma in its entirety. I am on several medications that allow me to go about my life. I couldn't imagine my life without them, nor would I want to. But these companies can be so damn greedy. Anyway, as more and more people began taking barbiturates, problems arose. Turns out that barbiturates are in fact subject to tolerance and dependence. As people take more and more to get the same effect, they were unknowingly putting themselves at risk of accidental overdose. And even when people realized that they were addicted and wanted to stop, withdrawal was extremely unpleasant and sometimes deadly. Not a surprise in 1951, but Congress decided that barbiturates should only be available through prescription. Of course, this meant that the pharmaceutical companies were producing them, and they began losing a lot of money. So what did they do? Well, they looked for a replacement, of course. In 1955, the first benzodiazepine was created, and within 5 years, it was available to the people under the name Librium. This new drug pretty much worked the same way. And again, just like every medication before, it was pronounced to be completely safe. But if it was, I wouldn't be here talking about it, would I? Nope. Turns out it was practically the same. Tolerance and dependence, and they were just as difficult to get off of, not to mention the risk of overdose. Soon, though, Librium was joined on the market by another medication you're probably familiar with, Valium. Side story, I took a single Valium before I had my wisdom teeth out because I was so terrified of needles at the time, and oh my god, I was so high. I was so relaxed and giggly. Turns out, though, that my fear of needles at the time was still stronger than the medication, and I ended up hyperventilating. They tried giving me laughing gas, but I wasn't able to breathe deeply enough, so they just had to go for it. But before that, I was loving the Valium, so I can definitely imagine why it's so popular. But back to benzos. Soon enough, there were other benzos on the market, Klonopin and Ativan. Supposedly they were safer because they needed lower doses, so they carried less risk, right? Surprise, they didn't. They required a smaller dosage because they were more potent. Then, in the early 80s, they were also joined by Xanny the Xanax. During the 80s, benzos became highly regulated in many countries. And in the UK, 14,000 people were involved in suing the pharmaceutical companies for their negligence in marketing the benzos. An American study in the 90s showed that 80% of people who took benzodiazepines were affected by withdrawal symptoms when they stopped taking them. Yet, as the 90s progressed, more and more people began taking them. By the end of the first decade of the 2000s, more than 5% of Americans were regularly taking benzodiazepines. But let's go back to the 1930s and the Depression. More than a decade after the narcotics clinics closed, in the mid to late 1930s, as the Great Depression waned, a couple narcotics farms were opened, one in Lexington, Kentucky, and the other in Fort Worth, Texas. The goals of these farms were to take addicts out of their city environments and put them on farms where they could be useful, get and stay sober, and stay away from temptation. Unfortunately, the relapse rate was extremely high. Turns out that it wasn't just getting clean that was the key to sobriety. As time went on, heroin went from being associated with middle-class white people or Asian immigrants to being associated with poor black people. It had completely changed by the time that World War II was over, and by the 1950s, half of all people arrested on narcotics charges were black. It's hard to say, though, how much of these statistics were influenced by racial prejudice. Blacks were more likely to be arrested than whites, especially in the segregated South. In a time where police may have had quotas to fill, as one article said, it is easier to ticket, arrest, and prosecute those who are relatively powerless. And in the decades after that, as blacks fled the South in hopes for better lives in the northern states, many of them ended up in city neighborhoods now known as ghettos. Unfortunately, crime and poverty were abundant, and so were narcotics, and it became a way for some to cope with their lives. But instead of looking at doing something about the social and economic conditions that plagued black communities, politicians in the 1950s decided to deal with the rise of drug use among blacks with increased drug enforcement. Between 1951 and 1956, even harsher laws and mandatory jail time for possession and sale of drugs was introduced. It became absolutely egregious. One black man who was a military veteran who had no criminal record had gotten caught selling marijuana. His sentence, 50 years without parole. One particular law in Texas declared that the mere possession of marijuana could carry anywhere from 2 years in prison all the way up to a freaking life sentence. People were sent to prison for the rest of their lives for mere possession of a substance that millions of Americans can buy legally in stores today. Insane. In spite of all of the efforts to stem narcotics abuse, drugs were still getting into the country in staggering amounts. Turns out that the amount of money to be made from the sale of narcotics was too strong to be tamed by any restrictive laws that the government could come up with. And when the police were able to take out a supplier or trafficker, the supply would dip, meaning that the prices went up. When that happened, it enticed other criminals to join in, make good fast money. It drove up crime and left behind more ruthless dealers than before. Finally realizing that there was really only one way to reduce the amount of illicit drugs was to look into the users themselves. Programs finally began popping up to help. These programs were like rehabs that we see today that focus on therapy. These programs were like the rehabs that we see today that focus on therapy. The first one to open up was Synanon in Ocean Park, California. It was the first drug rehab, and pathetically, it devolved over the next decade into a dangerous and notorious cult. But I'll leave that there, as I have actually done 2 videos on that cult, so check it out. Regardless, it did lead to other rehab facilities to open in the following years. Then, in 1965, a study was done that found up to half of all urban crime was due to people trying to support their drug habits. This study also looked at other Western countries that hadn't taken as hard an approach to medical maintenance of habits and realized that their crime levels were much lower. So essentially, the study learned that by criminalizing drug addiction, it literally only led to more crime. It was also in the 1960s that drug addiction went from being seen as a moral failing back to a medical affliction. So in the 1960s, people began looking at the possibility of medical maintenance. One doctor who had decided to conduct a study on it put some people on morphine and some on methadone. He learned that the patients on morphine could not be maintained and were constantly showing up at his office asking for more. He observed, though, that those who were given methadone had developed an addiction to methadone now, but they were able to function in society, whereas those who were addicted to morphine couldn't. Seeing methadone as the lesser of 2 evils and that they could reduce harm, doctors were permitted to begin prescribing methadone to addicted patients. Since methadone was cheap and could be gotten legally, there was also a drop in crime. Imagine that. But, of course, there are always still critics. Often those who stood to lose if methadone became a regular treatment, i.e., people who worked at the rehab centers. At that time, rehab centers didn't believe that they could coexist with methadone treatment. And although methadone didn't eliminate addiction and crime, it definitely did reduce it. And surprisingly, in the early 70s, the president at the time, Nixon, got behind methadone maintenance and other drug abuse prevention programs in a political move to further reduce crime on a national scale. The biggest problem facing the expansion of the new methadone clinics were the communities where they were going to open, where the stigma of drug use was still alive and well, but also from the prospective methadone users who didn't want to involve themselves. Just as the COVID vaccine was surrounded with so much debate, so is methadone. A lot of people believe that methadone would be worse for them than doing the drugs that they were already doing. And I kid you not, one of the reported fears was that if they started getting treatment, they would be looked down upon by their peers, like they couldn't hack the lifestyle anymore. Definitely odd to me that they're worried at all about what other addicts think about you getting clean, but you do you. If you haven't guessed yet, I don't believe that drugs should be outlawed outright. Controlled, yes, but I also feel like doing and possessing drugs shouldn't be criminalized. Selling, sure, absolutely, but come on. It only makes it harder for those facing addiction to get help. And for those who haven't gotten to the point where they want to get help yet, to keep them as safe as possible through harm reduction. I guess this is the point where I tell you I have a degree in public health, so the well-being of people, especially on a large scale, is important to me. Anyway, moving on. When we reached the 1980s, something unbelievable, if not predictable, happened. The emergence of a new and terrifying disease that at the time was 100% fatal. HIV/AIDS. On another video someday, at some point, I will go into full detail on the AIDS pandemic, so I won't get into the full history here. But what you need to know is that it has a long incubation time. So people who are infected and contagious usually have no idea that they're infected. And at the time, blood tests were not available. It spread through bodily fluids, but most important for this topic, through blood. But why is that important? Because by the late 80s in New York City, 1/3 of the people who had AIDS were IV drug users. These people contracted the virus through sharing needles. Since these people had no idea that they were infected, they often unknowingly infected their sexual partners or even their babies during the birthing process. As you can imagine, this did nothing to reduce the stigma of illicit drug use, and they became even bigger pariahs than ever before. But let's move on. In 1990, the first pain patch came out. It allowed the pain medication called fentanyl, yes, fentanyl, to be slowly absorbed through the skin over the course of 3 days before a new patch would be applied. The new medication was just as addictive as other opioids, and people would abuse it in different ways. They would apply more than one patch at a time to get a bigger hit, or they would chew the patch to get high, or they would damage the patch in a way that would allow them to receive the whole dose at one time. As you can imagine, the fentanyl pain patch is incredibly dangerous, so it's usually only prescribed to terminal cancer patients and hospice patients. Then, in 1995, a big one hit the market, OxyContin. Suddenly, this new medication was taking off like you couldn't imagine. The company that produced it, Purdue, promised, just like every drug before it, that it wasn't addictive or dangerous. Since it was a 12-hour release medication, then the potential for it being abused should be less, right? Because no one ever has crushed and then injected or snorted or swallowed a pill before. Documents created by Purdue and later released during trials showed that from the beginning, Purdue wanted this new opioid, OxyContin, to be targeted towards non-cancer patients with chronic pain. Even before OxyContin hit the market, it was questionable. Data showed that a clinical trial done by Purdue originally had 133 patients. By the end of the trial, only 63 participants remained. Why did that happen, you ask? because 82% of the people enrolled in the trial said they had some sort of, quote, adverse event during taking the medication. Literally half of the people said, screw this, and stopped taking OxyContin. And then Purdue scrapped the drug. No, just kidding. They decided to put it on the market. They claimed that it demonstrated that it was a safe and effective analgesic. And they projected that once available, that there would be 68 million prescriptions filled each freaking year. Then, in an even more sketchy AF move, they had their pharmaceutical reps take doctors out to restaurants to wine and dine them in exchange for them agreeing to prescribe OxyContin to their patients. Even though, at the time, it was legal and for the most part still is, it certainly isn't ethical. Throughout the rest of the 90s and into the 2000s, they pushed for OxyContin to be marketed to chronic pain patients, completely ignoring the fact that long-term use usually resulted in addiction. But hey, addiction meant more money, because it's always about money. Even as deaths from prescriptions rose, they continued to push for more and more prescriptions. I saw a stat that said the state of Kentucky, just Kentucky, had 78 drug reps convincing doctors of the safety of OxyContin. You know what else? 78% of drug overdoses were caused by prescription opioids in 2022. I wonder if all those drug reps sleep well at night. And then came the deadliest drug that we've seen so far. It is a drug that needs no introduction. I've already mentioned it. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you fentanyl. But no, it isn't until the second half of the 2010s that fentanyl really came into its own. Where OxyContin began the opioid epidemic, the modern one, fentanyl made it its own. What surprised me was that fentanyl was first created 65 years ago and was first used only as an anesthetic for surgery. Then someone had the bright idea, hey, let's use this pain medication that is 100 times stronger than morphine as a chronic pain medication. Oh, people have a hard time breathing on it? No biggie, we'll just lower the dosage. No way that it can be abused. By the way, it costs 1/10 to produce a kilo of fentanyl than it does heroin. Oh, and because it's so potent, you just need a little bit of it for an incredible high. It can be sold in the smallest amounts and makes it very difficult for the police to stop it from being smuggled in. It's the perfect drug for the modern trafficker. The biggest danger, in my opinion, is when people have no idea that they're even doing fentanyl until it's too late. These people think that they're doing a different drug, like cocaine or heroin, but it's laced with fentanyl. Or they believe that they're taking a benzo or an oxy, only for toxicology during their autopsy to show that they actually died from acute fentanyl poisoning. The pill was just fentanyl. It was everywhere, and people have begun to die from it, but with no sign of it slowing down. Again, in my personal opinion, I think the best thing that we can do for people facing drug addiction is to decriminalize it and to practice harm reduction through needle exchange and giving these people a safe place to do their drugs with Narcan and trained staff on site until these people reach a point where they are ready to get clean. And that's it for today. If you liked today's video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, don't forget to be merry, but stay morbid.